Tonight, we continue our long-form journey through the origins of the Second World War with Episode 3. In the last episode, we drifted through the Russian Revolution, witnessing the end of an empire and the shifting tides that redefined the East. Now, as you settle in and let the day fade, we turn our gaze toward Western Europe, specifically to Italy and Germany. Tonight's story explores the rise of Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. We will trace the years following the Great War, where economic hardship and political uncertainty created the quiet openings for new, authoritarian voices to take hold. I've spent a great deal of time researching and crafting this narrative so it can guide you gently towards sleep while still giving you a clear, steady understanding of how these two figures moved from the fringes of politics to the center of the world stage. If this calm style helps you rest, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe. And if you'd like, share where you're listening from and what time of night you've joined us. It's always interesting to see who is listening from around the world. Take a slow breath, and let's begin. A new kind of politics crept across Europe in the years after the Great War, not as a tidy blueprint but as a restless, improvisational force that fed on fear and longing. It arrived first in one guise, then in another. In Italy it took the name fascism, in Germany it hardened into Nazism. Both movements promised restoration and renewal, and both found their most potent expression in the personalities of two men who would come to dominate their nations and, in time, the world. Those men were Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. The appeal was elemental. Societies exhausted by conflict and humiliation sought anchors. People who had once trusted institutions now felt betrayed by them. In this unsettled climate, loud promises of order and national rebirth sounded less like rhetoric and more like a remedy. Those promises were wrapped in spectacle and delivered with theatrical certainty, and they reached into every corner of public life, into factories and churches, into cafes and classrooms, until private thought itself began to bend toward the public will. Mussolini and Hitler were different in temperament and origin, yet they converged on a similar political logic. The individual subsumed beneath the state, the cult of obedience, and the elevation of a single leader as the living embodiment of national destiny. Each man learned to read the anxieties of his people and to translate them into a language of action. Each cultivated a presence that made crowds still and made dissent seem not merely wrong but dangerous. Their movements promised both revolution and restoration, a curious mixture that reassured the middle classes while thrilling the dispossessed. There was beneath the surface a shared hostility to liberal democracy and to the pluralism it required. Multi-party systems, with their compromises and messy debates, were portrayed as weak and indecisive. In their place rose the claim that a single, unified will could cut through paralysis and restore greatness. For Hitler, this anti-democratic posture was fused with a virulent racial doctrine that placed Aryan purity at the center of political life. For Mussolini, the rhetoric of national unity and strength was more Mediterranean in its origins, though it would later absorb harsher strains of exclusion and aggression. Both movements also defined themselves by what they opposed. Communism, with its internationalist rhetoric and promise of class revolution, was anathema. The new regimes cast themselves as bulwarks against red upheaval, and in doing so they won the tacit support of conservative elites who feared social disorder more than authoritarian rule. Businessmen, landowners, and clerics who might once have recoiled at radicalism found themselves making uneasy accommodations, persuaded that a strong hand could preserve property and tradition while crushing the left. The methods of ascent were as important as the ideas. Paramilitary groups, uniforms, and ritualized displays of loyalty created a sense of belonging and purpose for men displaced by war and economic dislocation. Street violence became a political instrument. Intimidation and spectacle replaced debate. Newspapers, rallies, and radio were harnessed to shape perception, and the leaders who mastered these tools could make the nation listen when they spoke. Over time, the state's machinery and the leader's persona fused, until the distinction between ruler and regime blurred. It is worth pausing to feel the texture of that era. The slow, heavy air of cities still scarred by conflict. The long lines at bread shops. The whispered conversations in tramcars about lost honor and stolen futures. In such small, ordinary moments the seeds of radical change took root, and the grand narratives of history found their foothold in the daily grievances of millions. The promise of decisive action, of someone who would sweep away corruption, punish the guilty, and restore pride, was not merely political. It was almost pastoral in its consolation, a balm for wounded identities. Yet the consolation came at a price. The new regimes demanded not only loyalty but the surrender of critical thought. Intellectuals, artists, and teachers found themselves suspect. Institutions that once nurtured debate were recast as instruments of instruction and discipline. The state's claim on the individual extended into the most intimate spheres of life, and dissent was reframed as betrayal. Over time, the machinery of propaganda and coercion normalized behaviors and beliefs that, in calmer times, would have been unthinkable. There was also a theatrical cruelty to the process. Symbols were chosen with care: the bundle of rods, the black shirt, the swastika, each a shorthand for authority and unity, each designed to be seen and to be felt. Parades and rallies were not mere celebrations. They were rehearsals in obedience, exercises in collective identity that made the crowd itself an instrument of power. The leaders who orchestrated these spectacles learned to read the crowd's mood and to amplify it, turning private anxieties into public fervor. And so, in the space of a few years, two very different nations found themselves swept into similar currents. Italy, which had emerged from the war on the winning side yet felt shortchanged and unstable, became fertile ground for a movement promising order and grandeur. Germany, defeated and humiliated, became a crucible for a doctrine that fused national revival with racial myth. In each case, the promise of renewal was intoxicating. In each case, the cost would be measured in freedoms lost and lives destroyed. A certain hunger moved through Europe after the war, quiet at first and then louder, like wind gathering in the hollows of a ruined town. People wanted certainty. They wanted a hand to steady them, and they wanted a story that made sense of loss. Into that hunger stepped two leaders who spoke with absolute conviction, and their words found purchase in soil made soft by fear and disappointment. Each offered a narrative of rebirth, and each wrapped that promise in a language of power that felt, to many, like relief. Both movements traded in absolutes. They presented the world as a place of enemies and of friends, of purity and of corruption, and they offered a single remedy: the restoration of national greatness through unified, uncompromising authority. This was not merely political rhetoric. It was a moral architecture that reorganized loyalties and reordered priorities, insisting that private concerns be subordinated to the public will. Citizens were invited to belong, and belonging required sacrifice. The individual was recast as a cell within a larger organism, and the organism demanded obedience. There was a practical side to this appeal as well. In economies strained by inflation, unemployment, and the dislocations of demobilization, the promise of stability had a tangible value. Business owners and landholders, anxious about strikes and expropriation, found the new regime's anti-communist posture reassuring, and many lent their support in the hope of preserving property and order. At the same time, veterans and the unemployed, who had been promised honor and reward, were drawn by the spectacle of camaraderie and the chance to reclaim dignity. The movements thus knitted together unlikely allies, offering protection to the established and purpose to the dispossessed. Yet beneath the pragmatic alliances lay deeper convictions that shaped policy and practice. Both ideologies rejected the messy pluralism of parliamentary democracy, arguing that debate and compromise were signs of weakness rather than strength. They favored a centralized, hierarchical state in which decisions flowed downward and dissent was treated as a threat. In this model, the leader was not merely a head of government but the living symbol of the nation's will, a figure whose authority was both political and almost sacred. Ritual and ceremony reinforced this sacralization, turning politics into a kind of civic liturgy. The two movements diverged, however, in the content of their exclusions. In Italy, the rhetoric emphasized national unity, the revival of Roman grandeur, and a cooperative vision of society in which different economic groups would be organized into state-supervised syndicates. In Germany, the doctrine incorporated a racial mythology that placed the so-called Aryan people at the center of history and cast certain groups, above all, Jews, as existential threats to the nation's purity. Where Mussolini's early formulations were more focused on state supremacy and national rejuvenation, Hitler's program fused authoritarianism with a virulent, pseudo-scientific racism that would become central to Nazi policy. Both systems, however, shared a contempt for intellectual autonomy. Universities, the press, and cultural institutions were pressured to conform. Independent thought was suspect, and critical voices were marginalized or silenced. Education was recast as a means of inculcating loyalty, and the arts were harnessed to glorify the state. Over time, the machinery of propaganda and censorship made it difficult to distinguish between genuine consent and coerced conformity, and the line between persuasion and compulsion blurred until it was nearly invisible. The methods of mobilization were strikingly similar. Paramilitary groups provided muscle and spectacle, and uniforms and symbols created a visible sense of unity. Public rituals, marches, salutes, mass rallies were choreographed to produce emotional intensity and to bind individuals into a collective rhythm. Radio and print were used to saturate the public sphere with a single voice, and the leaders who mastered these media could shape perceptions with extraordinary speed. The result was a politics that operated as much through feeling as through argument, and that made dissent feel not only futile but morally suspect. There was also a moral calculus at work that justified violence in the name of renewal. Both movements argued that extraordinary times required extraordinary measures, and that the ends, national rebirth, social order, racial purification, could justify means that would otherwise be unthinkable. This logic permitted the use of intimidation, imprisonment, and even murder as instruments of policy, and it created a climate in which brutality could be rationalized as necessary cleansing. Once normalized, such measures fed on themselves, and the threshold for cruelty steadily lowered. A narrow lane in the Romagna Hills held the first sounds of Benito Mussolini's life. The clink of a blacksmith's hammer, the rustle of schoolbooks, the low prayers of a devout mother. He was born into a household of contrasts, an energetic mother who taught in the village school and a father who worked iron and cherished anarchist ideas, so that the child's world was at once disciplined and defiant. From the start, his name carried a kind of borrowed grandeur. His father, admiring the Mexican reformer Benito Juárez, bestowed the name with a mixture of irony and hope. The small details of that upbringing mattered. The push and pull between piety and rebellion, the smell of coal and ink, the sense that ordinary life could be both a refuge and a provocation. School did not tame him. He was restless, and his restlessness found expression in acts that startled his teachers and alarmed his peers. Sent to a Salesian school to be steadied, he was expelled after a knife fight. Later, at a state training school for teachers, he repeated the offense and escaped further censure. These episodes were not merely youthful mischief. They were early signs of a temperament that combined impulsive violence with theatrical bravado. When he took his first teaching post at 18, the same year he began an affair with a married woman. The pattern of transgression and charm had already been set. In a jealous moment he stabbed her, and the story of that wound would linger like a private, shameful echo in later years. The next turn in his life carried him beyond Italy's borders. Compulsory military service loomed, and Mussolini fled to Switzerland, a place that offered both exile and education in the rough school of political life. He worked with his hands, masonry and odd jobs, and sometimes he begged, learning the textures of poverty and the rhythms of itinerant life. It was there, among exiles and agitators, that he met Angelika Balabanov, a Russian émigré whose knowledge of Marxist theory and revolutionary tactics would reshape his ambitions. She became a mentor and a conduit into the world of socialist journalism, and under her influence Mussolini began to write with a new intensity, contributing to socialist papers and sharpening a voice that could be both polemical and performative. Back in Italy, the war years and their aftermath provided the raw material for his transformation. He returned under an amnesty, completed his military service, and resumed teaching, but the pull of politics and the press had become irresistible. He founded a weekly called La Lotta di Class, the class struggle, and poured his energies into it, using the printed page as a laboratory for ideas and a platform for provocation. His writing was not merely doctrinaire, it carried a literary streak, and he even produced a scandalous novel, The Cardinal's Mistress, that hinted at a taste for drama and scandal beyond the political pamphlet. The First World War was a crucible. Italy's entry into the conflict in 1915 split the socialist movement, and Mussolini's own position shifted in a way that would define his future. As editor of Avanti, the socialist daily, he had once thundered for neutrality, but then he reversed course and urged intervention on the Allied side. The volte-face was explosive. Party leaders denounced him, colleagues called him traitor, and he was expelled from the Socialist Party. The reasons for his change were debated then and remain debated now. Some contemporaries whispered of secret subsidies from foreign governments seeking to sway Italian policy. But whatever the motive, the result was decisive. He left with a newspaper and a new, more personal politics. With Illinois Popolo d'Italia, he fashioned a voice that could appeal to veterans, to the middle classes, and to the restless young. The paper proclaimed itself socialist in name but rejected pacifism and embraced a militant nationalism that promised action and dignity. Mussolini's own wartime service, he saw action on the Alpine front and returned with the rank of sergeant, gave him the credentials of sacrifice and the aura of a man who had shared the trenches with the men he now sought to lead. The post-war years, with their inflation, strikes, and demobilized soldiers, were a landscape of grievance. In that landscape Mussolini began to plant the seeds of a movement. The idea of the fascio, a bundle, a unity, took shape in Milan. Using the columns of his paper and the networks of veterans, he called for a new kind of organization. The Fascio di Combattimento, a combat group that would defend veterans' claims, oppose foreign imperialism harmful to Italy, and fight what Mussolini called the milk and water candidates in elections. The first meeting, held in a modest hall off the Piazza San Sepolcro, drew a mixed crowd: veterans, Adolf shock troops, shopkeepers, and curious citizens, and only a fraction signed on at once. Yet the image mattered more than the numbers. The word fascio itself, borrowed from the Roman fasces, evoked authority and unity, and the symbolism would prove magnetic. From those modest beginnings, the movement grew by combining spectacle with practical violence. The Arditi, with their swagger and black shirts, offered muscle and myth. They were veterans who had tasted the adrenaline of combat and now sought a cause that would restore honor and provide purpose. Mussolini learned to harness their energy, to direct their anger toward political opponents, and to present himself as the organizer who could turn chaos into order. He was adept at playing both sides, promising social reform to the dispossessed while assuring property owners and clerics that their interests would be protected, and this double language widened his appeal. From the outset, the movement combined ritual with readiness. The Arditi, with their swagger and black shirts, supplied both myth and muscle. They were veterans who had tasted the intensity of combat and now sought a cause that would restore honor and provide direction. Their uniforms and gestures were not mere costume. They were a language of belonging that could be read at a glance. When men put on the black shirt, they were not only dressing for a rally. They were stepping into a role that promised dignity, recognition, and a place in a new order. He used his paper to raise funds and to recruit, and he cultivated networks among veterans and local leaders who could mobilize men quickly. The movement's early growth was uneven and improvisational, yet it had a certain momentum. Local fasci multiplied, and the idea of a national movement began to feel less like a dream and more like an unfolding reality. In towns and neighborhoods, small groups met, exchanged plans, and learned the choreography of public action. How to march, how to intimidate, how to make a presence felt. Violence, when it came, was both instrument and spectacle. The squadristi, bands of tough men drawn from veterans and restless youths, were organized to confront socialists and communists in the streets, to break strikes, and to intimidate union organizers. Their methods were brutal at times, and their actions were often tacitly tolerated by local authorities who feared red disorder more than right-wing violence. The squadristi's raids and brawls were not random. They were part of a strategy to make public life unsafe for opponents and to present fascism as the force that could restore calm. In this way, coercion became a form of political theater, and the theater itself helped to recruit more men into the movement. Mussolini's skill lay in balancing menace with reassurance. He spoke the language of revolution to the dispossessed, promising to take from the rich and give to the poor, while at the same time assuring property owners and clerics that their wealth and status would be protected. This double register widened his appeal and made it possible for him to draw support from unlikely quarters. Industrialists who feared socialism, bankers who feared chaos, and ordinary citizens who feared the breakdown of order. The movement thus knitted together disparate interests under the banner of national renewal. The early electoral tests were humbling, yet instructive. In the first post-war elections, the fascists won few votes, and Mussolini himself fared poorly at the ballot box. But the setback did not signal failure. Rather, it taught a lesson about the limits of parliamentary politics and the potency of extra-parliamentary pressure. The movement learned to use both the press and the street, to combine propaganda with intimidation, and to exploit moments of crisis to expand its influence. Over time, the fasci grew in number and in confidence, and the black-shirted squads became a visible presence in many towns. A quiet provincial town shaped the first moments of Adolf Hitler's life, a place of narrow streets and orderly routines where a boy's ambitions could grow in secret and then, like a root, push through the soil. He left Linz as a teenager with a sketchbook under his arm and a stubborn conviction that architecture or painting might be his calling. And yet the world he entered in Vienna proved both richer and harsher than his drawings had imagined. The city offered music and libraries, opera houses and pamphlets. And in those crowded rooms Hitler found both solace and a new vocabulary of grievance that would later harden into conviction. Rejection from the Academy of Fine Arts was a wound he carried with him, and it altered the arc of Hitler's life more than any single lecture or critique could have done. He turned from formal training to the quieter work of selling watercolors and posters, eking out a living in men's hostels and living on small stipends, and in that precariousness he learned the rhythms of survival. Hitler kept strict habits: no smoking, no drinking, a simple diet, and in those small disciplines he found a sense of order that contrasted with the disorder of his circumstances, while the operas of Wagner and the public libraries became refuges where he could feed a growing appetite for myth and history. Vienna at the time was a cosmopolitan hub, a mosaic of peoples and languages, and the city's pamphleteers and polemicists filled its streets with urgent, often bitter talk about identity and decline. In those printed pages Hitler discovered ideas that would later become central to his thinking: the notion of a threatened Germanic culture, the insistence on racial hierarchies, and the dream of a greater Germany that would gather scattered peoples into a single, commanding whole. These doctrines, read in the hush of a library or the glare of a cheap cafe, took on the texture of revelation for a young man who had already felt the sting of exclusion. When war came, Hitler crossed a border not only of geography but of belonging. Though Austrian by birth, he enlisted in a Bavarian regiment and found in military life a clarity he had not known in civilian years. The barracks and the front offered a code and a purpose, and he embraced them with a fervor that surprised even his comrades. Serving as a dispatch runner on the Western Front, Hitler moved through mud and shellfire, carrying messages between posts, and in those dangerous, intimate hours he earned recognition for bravery that would later be symbolized by the Iron Cross, second class, and then the rarer first class, honors that marked him as a soldier and lent weight to the voice he would raise in peacetime. The war left its marks in ways both visible and invisible. A gas attack near the end of the conflict temporarily blinded him, and a leg wound was a reminder of the body's vulnerability. Yet Hitler emerged convinced that he had been spared for a purpose larger than himself. That conviction would become a steady drumbeat in his rhetoric. The sense that history had singled him out, that fate had a plan, and that his mission was to translate personal survival into national destiny. In the chaotic months after the armistice, when Germany seemed to be unmoored and the new republic struggled for legitimacy, that certainty found a receptive audience among men who had also returned from the front with empty pockets and bruised pride. Munich, in early 1919, was a city on edge. The old certainties had been shaken, and political life was volatile. Short-lived councils and uprisings flickered like candles in a wind. Into this unsettled scene Hitler was assigned to the political department of the district command, a post that gave him a vantage point on the city's fractious debates and a task that suited his temperament: to monitor small, potentially subversive groups. One such group was the German Workers' Party, a modest assembly of nationalists and radicals that met in shabby rooms and counted its funds in marks and pfennigs. The assignment was meant to be routine, but it became the hinge on which Hitler's future turned. At a meeting of that party he found not a foreign threat but a mirror of his own longings: fervent nationalism, a hunger for mass support, and a willingness to compete with the left for the loyalty of workers and veterans. The party's executive committee met in a back room of a tavern, and the scene was at once comic and charged. Minutes read aloud, a treasurer's report that amounted to pocket change, and a handful of men who spoke with outsized conviction. Hitler listened, and then, almost imperceptibly, he began to imagine himself within that small world, not as an observer but as an architect of its future. 2 days after that first encounter, Hitler joined, becoming member number 55, and the decision was less a sudden conversion than a practical resolution. Here was a vehicle through which he might escape anonymity and shape a movement in his own image. He brought to the party a talent for oratory and a hunger for organization, and he set about learning how to command attention, how to read a crowd, and how to turn grievance into momentum. The party was small, its resources meager, but it offered a stage, and Hitler was determined to make the most of it. A coastal city became a stage for audacity, and the drama that unfolded there would echo far beyond its harbor. Fiume, a place caught between competing claims and tangled loyalties after the war, was declared a free city by diplomats who could not reconcile rival nationalisms. For many Italians the decision felt like a wound, and into that stepped a man who loved spectacle as much as he loved his country. Gabriele D'Annunzio arrived like a thunderclap. He was a poet and a showman, a wartime flyer who had lost an eye and kept the public's imagination with the same ease he kept a room's attention. Without waiting for permission from any government, he gathered a band of roughly 1,000 armed followers, sailed to Fiume, and proclaimed himself its commander. The act was illegal and theatrical at once. It was a private seizure that read like an epic poem, and the Italian public, hungry for bold gestures, responded with astonishment and, in many quarters, with admiration. For 15 months the Regency in Fiume was a laboratory of political theater. Flags and banners transformed the city's sober facades into a carnival of authority, and D'Annunzio staged daily parades that were equal parts pageant and proclamation. He introduced a set of rituals, black uniforms, dramatic salutes, and a litany of commands and responses that made the crowd itself into a living emblem of power. The dagger, the truncheon, and the curious threat of castor oil for dissenters were not merely props. They were instruments of intimidation that taught a population how to obey and how to fear. The Regency also experimented with economic and administrative forms that anticipated later fascist ideas. Corporations and state-run enterprises were set up to manage labor and production, and the death penalty and other harsh measures underscored the regime's intolerance of opposition. In practice, the experiment was chaotic and often cruel, but in symbolism it was potent. A small city had been remade into a theater of unity and discipline, and the performance suggested that such remaking might be possible on a larger stage. Mussolini watched with a mixture of envy and calculation. He admired the spectacle and the way D'Annunzio had seized the public imagination, even as he distrusted the poet's larger-than-life ego. For a time he became an ardent supporter, using his newspaper to raise funds and to celebrate the Regency's audacity. Money flowed in, and the columns of Illinois Popolo d'Italia carried appeals that turned curiosity into cash. Yet the funds did not always reach their ostensible destination. Some of the resources raised for Fiume were redirected to support the nascent fascist movement and to back candidates in Italy's first post-war elections. The electoral test in November 1919 was sobering. The fascists, still a new and uneven formation, failed to win seats, and Mussolini's own showing was modest. Only a few thousand votes in a contest dominated by established parties. The setback did not, however, extinguish the movement's momentum. It taught lessons about the limits of ballots and the potency of extra-parliamentary pressure. In the months that followed, the movement learned to combine propaganda with force, and to use spectacle not only to inspire but to intimidate. Street violence began to take on a political logic. Bands of veterans and young men, inspired by the rituals they had seen in Fiume and elsewhere, organized into squads that could be deployed against socialist meetings and labor organizers. The black shirt became more than a costume. It was a uniform of belonging and a signal that politics had entered a new register, one where public order was enforced by those who claimed to embody the nation's will. The tactics were crude and often brutal, but they were effective in creating a climate of fear that made many citizens long for stability, even at the cost of liberty. The years after the war were a time of fits and starts for both movements, moments of public failure followed by rapid reinvention, and the lesson learned was that ballots alone would not win the day. In Italy, the first post-war elections were a rude awakening. The new fasci was still small and disorganized, and Mussolini's own showing was modest, a reminder that spectacle and newspapers did not instantly translate into parliamentary strength. Yet the setback taught a different lesson. When votes failed, pressure could be applied in other, more immediate ways, and the movement began to learn how to combine propaganda with force. The leaders in both countries learned to read crowds and to stage events that amplified emotion. Rallies were choreographed to produce intensity. Banners and uniforms created a sense of unity, and the press and pamphlets repeated simple slogans until they lodged in the public mind. In this way, a movement that might have remained a local curiosity was made to feel national in scope, and the sense of inevitability it projected attracted more recruits and more resources. There was also a personal dimension to these developments. Mussolini, now a national figure, had to manage ambitious local bosses who sometimes resented his compromises. Hitler, meanwhile, cultivated a public persona that could be both menacing and oddly courtly, and he learned to use that persona to win attention beyond Munich. Both men discovered that power could be accelerated by combining the theatrical with the coercive, and that the street could be turned into an instrument of political persuasion. A slow, deliberate movement began to gather in the Italian countryside and in the stations between cities, a movement that looked less like a sudden uprising and more like a long, rehearsed procession. Men boarded trains and buses with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before, and yet there was an improvisational edge to it, a readiness to turn whatever plan existed into action, and to let circumstance do the rest. The march was as much a performance as a political maneuver, and its success would depend as much on timing and theater as on force. By 1922, Mussolini's network of local bosses, the Ras, had become a power in their own right. They controlled districts, commanded loyalty, and expected Mussolini to translate their street authority into national influence. When they decided to press for control of the central government, they did so with the blunt instruments they knew best: mass mobilization, visible columns of black shirts, and the threat, always present, of violence. The plan was not a single, tightly choreographed military campaign. It was a series of converging pressures designed to make the existing government appear weak and indecisive. Mussolini himself moved with a mixture of calculation and theatrical restraint. He spoke in public with the cadence of a man who had learned how to hold attention, and he cultivated an image that suggested both danger and respectability. Behind the scenes, negotiations and offers were exchanged. Politicians who feared the instability of the moment tried to co-opt him, while others hoped to use him as a tool to displace rivals. The king and his advisors watched nervously as the columns assembled, uncertain whether to resist a force that might be easily dispersed or to accommodate a movement that seemed to command popular energy. On the appointed days, thousands of men gathered at assembly points outside Rome. They did not all march on foot. Many traveled by train and bus, arriving in groups that could be presented as spontaneous reinforcements rather than a single, threatening mass. The logistics were imperfect, transport faltered in places, food supplies were strained, and the columns stalled at times. But the image of a converging force was enough to unsettle the capital. In the end, the spectacle mattered as much as the numbers. A few thousand black shirts arriving in special trains could be framed as the vanguard of a national movement, and that framing was what the strategists counted on. The government's response was hesitant. Premier Luigi Factor considered declaring a state of siege and ordering the army to disperse the marchers, but the king balked at the idea of using force against Italians who claimed to be restoring order. Instead of a decisive crackdown, a series of offers and counteroffers followed, and the uncertainty itself became a weapon. Mussolini, who had been waiting in Milan, received overtures from politicians and was offered posts in a bid to neutralize the threat. He played the moment with care, refusing some offers and demanding written confirmation of any appointment, a small but telling insistence that underscored his desire for legitimacy as well as power. When the telegram arrived, it changed the tone of the whole enterprise. Mussolini boarded a train and traveled to Rome, not as a fugitive or a rebel but as a man summoned into the corridors of authority. The arrival of black-shirted contingents in the capital the following day was less a storming than a parade. Wet, disheartened in places by rain, but unmistakable in its symbolism. The march had been, in many respects, a token occupation of a citadel that had already been ceded by those who feared the consequences of resistance. Once in office, Mussolini moved quickly to consolidate his position. He accepted the trappings of government while making clear that his authority would not be constrained by the old parliamentary routines. The new premier spoke of restoring order and of giving Italy the stability it craved, and he used the language of national renewal to justify sweeping powers. The black shirts, once a street force, were now the visible arm of a regime that claimed to speak for the nation. Their presence in public life signaled a new relationship between violence and authority. The March on Rome was not merely a seizure of office. It was a lesson in political theater. It showed how a combination of spectacle, intimidation, and elite accommodation could produce a transfer of power without a pitched battle. It also revealed the fragility of institutions that lacked the will to defend themselves. When those entrusted with the state's instruments hesitated, the appearance of force could substitute for force itself. The event would be studied and imitated, and its implications would ripple outward as other movements observed how authority could be claimed by the bold and the patient. A new government took shape with a careful, almost theatrical modesty. Mussolini at first filled his cabinet with men who were not all of his own choosing, placing only a handful of fascists among 14 ministers so that the appearance of moderation might soothe anxious elites. The gesture was strategic. It suggested restraint while leaving room for a later, quieter transformation. In public he cultivated an image of control, and in private he measured how far he could push the institutions that still pretended to be independent. He did not long remain cautious. In the chamber he spoke with a tone that made the deputies feel small, and his contempt for parliamentary ritual was plain in the way he described the legislature's impotence and in the manner he implied that force could be substituted for debate. The assembly, cowed and uncertain, yielded emergency powers that allowed him to govern without its consent for a year. That legal veneer gave him the means to act quickly, and he used it to reshape the state's machinery in ways that would soon be irreversible. There was a curious contrast between the man's public posture and his private habits. He presented himself as a vigorous leader, and he cultivated a regimen of exercise, riding, boxing, fencing, that reinforced an image of bodily discipline. Yet he was not tall, and his physical presence was made memorable by a leonine face, dark, penetrating eyes, and a jaw that seemed to set his expression in stone. He kept a roughness about him that many found disconcerting, an occasional stubble, a disregard for some social niceties, and a restless appetite for women that became part of his legend. These personal details mattered because they shaped how he was seen, as a man of action, as a man who lived by impulse as well as calculation. At first, the country responded with a kind of relief. Strikes ended, factories reopened, and a brittle calm returned to streets that had known disorder. Mussolini's early measures promised stability, and many Italians welcomed the return of routine and commerce. He moved to consolidate power through legal changes as well as through force. A new electoral law was passed that awarded a supermajority of seats to the party that won the largest share of votes, provided it reached a modest threshold. The reform was designed to produce decisive government and to marginalize fractious coalitions. In the election that followed, the Fascists won a commanding plurality, and the results seemed to confirm that Mussolini's blend of spectacle and order had broad appeal. But the triumph was not unchallenged. A courageous voice rose in the chamber to denounce the election as tainted by fraud and intimidation, and the speaker's words cut through the official euphoria like a cold wind. He accused the regime of manipulating ballots and of using violence to silence opponents, and he warned that the new majority's legitimacy was built on coercion rather than consent. The speech was blunt and moral in tone. It unsettled many listeners and it angered those who had profited from the new order. 10 days later, the critic vanished. His disappearance was followed by the discovery of a body, and the nation's newspapers, those that still dared to print, filled their pages with outrage and suspicion. The non-fascist press, still a fragile remnant of a freer public sphere, pointed fingers at the government and at its paramilitary supporters. For a time Mussolini's popularity faltered. Badges were cast aside, and even some who had cheered the Blackshirts felt a cold unease. The opposition, hoping to force a constitutional reckoning, withdrew from Parliament in protest, expecting that the king or other institutions would intervene and demand accountability. The king did not act. The monarchy, wary of instability and of the prospect of civil strife, declined to press Mussolini to resign. The result was a political vacuum in which the regime could maneuver. 5 men, former members of the Agitator, veterans of the war and of street fighting, were eventually brought to trial for the murder. They claimed that their intent had been to abduct and rough up the critic, not to kill him. They said they had anticipated their leader's wishes without receiving explicit orders. The court sentences were brief, and a subsequent amnesty reduced the penalties further, a sequence that suggested both complicity and the limits of legal redress under the new dispensation. Mussolini, once he had steadied himself, moved decisively to close the space for dissent. He engineered the declaration that leftist seats were vacant and then presided over a parliament that had been hollowed of its opposition. He announced, with a voice that mixed paternal promise and stern command, that the nation desired peace and work and that he would provide them, by persuasion if possible and by force if necessary. Those words marked a turning point. Civil liberties were curtailed, the press was muzzled, and the institutions that had once allowed debate were recast as instruments of instruction and control. The transformation was not instantaneous, but it was relentless. Laws and decrees were used to centralize authority. Censorship and intimidation silenced critics, and the apparatus of the state was reorganized so that party and government moved in lockstep. Mussolini presented himself as the embodiment of national will, and the king's role became increasingly ceremonial. The rituals of governance were preserved, but their substance had been hollowed out. The forms remained while the freedoms they once protected were quietly removed. A beer hall's heat and the smell of spilled ale set the scene for an audacious gamble, and the moment itself felt both improvised and rehearsed. The Burgerbräukeller was crowded that evening with civil servants and officials, their coats damp from the Bavarian drizzle, and the low murmur of conversation rose and fell like a tide. Into that ordinary hum stepped a man who preferred drama to deliberation. Hitler entered with a small retinue, a revolver visible at his side, and the kind of certainty that makes a room hold its breath. He mounted a table as if it were a stage and fired a single shot into the ceiling, a sharp punctuation that turned chatter into silence. Hitler declared a national revolution, announced that the Bavarian government had been deposed, and proclaimed a provisional regime. The words were bold, the gesture theatrical. Yet beneath the bravado lay a fragile reality. The troops and police he claimed were marching in his support were, in fact, still in their barracks, and the provisional government existed only in his imagination. The bluff, however, had a momentum of its own, and for a time it seemed that audacity might substitute for force. 3 men, Kahr, Lossow, and Seisser, were seized and led into a side room, pressured to endorse the putsch. Their faces, in the dim light, showed neither panic nor immediate capitulation. They were calculating, and they were not easily cowed. Meanwhile, an envoy was dispatched to bring General Erich Ludendorff into the drama, and his arrival lent the scene a veneer of legitimacy. Ludendorff's presence quieted doubts and persuaded some in the hall that the movement had the backing of a respected wartime leader. The crowd cheered, and for a moment the illusion of unity held. Outside, the plan began to fray. The triumvirs, once released, used the channels they controlled to broadcast that the state had repudiated the putsch. The expected cascade of troops and police to the rebel banner did not materialize. The next morning, a column of some 2,000 marchers, stormtroopers and sympathizers, set out through Munich, their banners snapping in a cold wind, their songs and chants trying to turn fear into courage. The march met resistance at police cordons. A shot rang out, and in a brief exchange of fire several marchers and policemen fell. In the chaos, an envoy who had been walking arm in arm with Hitler was shot dead and dragged down, and Hitler himself was thrown to the pavement, his shoulder dislocated in the scuffle. The putsch collapsed in confusion and flight. Arrests followed quickly. The trial that ensued was not merely a legal proceeding. It became a stage on which the accused could perform and be seen by a nation still raw from defeat and humiliation. Hitler did not shrink from the charge of treason. Instead, he framed his actions as a moral crusade against a betrayal of the fatherland. His speeches in the courtroom were theatrical and unapologetic, and they struck a chord with many Germans who felt their nation had been wronged by the peace settlement and by weak governments. The trial lasted weeks, and the public attention it drew transformed a provincial agitator into a figure of national interest. The court's sympathies were not hidden. Ludendorff, the famed general, was acquitted, and the presiding judge made clear that the sentence for the principal defendant would be tempered. Hitler was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years, but the punishment was to be served in a comfortable fortress rather than a common prison, and the judge's assurances suggested he would not serve the full term. The leniency reflected more than personal favor. It revealed a society still divided, where institutions could be pliant to sentiment and where the line between criminality and political theater was blurred. Landsberg Fortress, where Hitler was confined, was a place of stone and quiet, a setting that encouraged reflection and, for some, reinvention. The cell was austere but not brutal, and the routine of confinement, measured walks in the courtyard, the scratch of a pen on paper, the slow turning of pages, became the medium for a new project. In that enforced solitude he wrote a book that would be part memoir and part manifesto, a work that stitched together personal grievance, political doctrine, and a program for national renewal. The manuscript was both confession and blueprint. It would later be called Mein Kampf, and it would serve as the ideological lodestar for the movement he led. The book's tone was at once intimate and programmatic. Hitler recounted episodes of his youth and the war, and he used those recollections to justify a larger political vision. He set out a narrative of betrayal and humiliation, and he proposed remedies that fused authoritarian rule with a racialized conception of national destiny. The prose was uneven, at times rambling, at times fiercely polemical, but its effect was cumulative. It offered followers a coherent story about who had wronged Germany and how the nation might be remade. In the quiet of Landsberg, failure was transmuted into a new kind of influence. When Hitler was released after less than a year, the man who emerged was not diminished by defeat. He had been transformed by it. The putsch's failure, the trial's publicity, and the book's circulation had elevated him from a regional agitator to a national figure with a growing audience. He left prison with a plan to pursue power by legal means, to build a mass movement that could win elections and then use the instruments of the state to realize the program he had set down in ink. The lesson he had learned in Landsberg was clear. Defeat could be converted into myth, and myth could be the engine of political ascent. A defeated movement can be reshaped in silence, and in the months after Landsberg a careful remaking began. The failure of a putsch had taught a lesson. Spectacle without structure could be fatal, and bravado without organization could be squandered. So the party turned inward to build itself anew, and in that quiet work it found the tools it would later use to command a nation. The reorganization was methodical. It was a patient architecture of offices, hierarchies, and cadres designed to turn fervor into a machine. The first task was discipline. Local cells were standardized, membership roles were tightened, and a chain of command was established so that orders could travel quickly and be obeyed without hesitation. The paramilitary formations were not abandoned. Rather, they were given clearer roles and a more disciplined posture. The brown shirts remained the visible muscle in the streets, but the party also cultivated an inner circle of loyalists whose oath was to Hitler alone. This dual structure, public force and private fidelity, would prove central to the movement's capacity to intimidate opponents while consolidating internal loyalty. Propaganda became the movement's lifeblood. Words and images were refined into instruments of persuasion, and a new cadre of specialists learned how to shape moods as much as opinions. Posters were designed to be read at a glance. Slogans were pared down to a few memorable phrases, and the party's meetings were staged with an eye to rhythm and spectacle. The aim was not merely to inform but to create an atmosphere in which listeners felt part of a larger destiny, and the techniques were honed until repetition itself became a kind of ritual. Joseph Goebbels emerged as a master of this craft, and under his direction the party's message was amplified with a modern intensity. He understood the power of new media and the psychology of crowds. He used film, radio, and the cinema of the street to make the Hitler's voice seem everywhere at once. Phonograph records of speeches were distributed so that a single voice could be replayed in parlors and meeting halls. News sheets and leaflets flooded towns, and the visual language of the movement, flags, banners, uniforms, was made unmistakable. The result was a saturation of the public sphere that left little room for nuance. Organization and propaganda worked in tandem. The party's administrative reforms made it possible to mobilize resources quickly, and the propaganda apparatus ensured that each mobilization felt like a national moment. Local leaders were trained to stage rallies that built emotional momentum. Stewards learned how to control crowds and to turn disorder into a spectacle of unity. The movement's public face was thus both choreographed and forceful, and the combination attracted recruits who sought belonging as much as political victory. The international context sharpened the party's appeal. Economic dislocations and the sense of national humiliation after the war created fertile ground for a message that promised restoration and revenge. The Young Plan, which proposed a schedule for reparations and set a distant end date, became a focal point for resentment. The party attacked it as another humiliation imposed by foreign powers, and in doing so it tapped into a deep, widespread grievance. The rhetoric against the plan was amplified by alliances with nationalist figures and media owners who could spread the critique across a broad audience. Electoral opportunity arrived when the wider economy faltered. The global downturn that followed the stock market crash of 1929 cut off the flow of foreign loans and threw millions into unemployment. In such a climate, the party's promises of decisive leadership and national revival resonated with many who felt abandoned by the old parties. In the parliamentary election of 1930, the movement made a dramatic advance, winning a substantial block of seats, 107 in the Reichstag, and transforming itself from a regional agitation into a national force that could no longer be ignored. That breakthrough was not merely numerical. It was psychological. The party's presence in the legislature gave it legitimacy and a platform from which to amplify its message, and the electoral gains convinced many elites that the movement could not be contained by conventional means. Industrialists and conservative politicians began to see the party as a force that might be harnessed or accommodated, and the political center found itself squeezed between fear of leftist upheaval and the rising tide on the right. A country can unravel in the space of a single season, and yet the unraveling often feels like a slow, inexorable loosening of threads that were already frayed. In the winter of 1923, Germany experienced such a loosening. The occupation of the Ruhr by French forces, a punitive response to missed reparations deliveries, set off a chain of events that turned economic strain into social catastrophe. The state answered with a policy of passive resistance. Workers walked away from machines and mines, and the government pledged to sustain them. That pledge was generous in intention and ruinous in consequence, for it required money the state did not possess, and so the presses began to run. The mark, once a stable measure of value, began to fall with a speed that stunned ordinary life. In January, the exchange rate hovered in the tens of thousands to the dollar. By midsummer it had leapt into the hundreds of thousands. By late summer it had crossed the million mark, and by autumn the figures read like the numbers of a fantasy, billions for a single dollar. People carried wheelbarrows of banknotes to buy bread. Wages were paid in the morning and worthless by evening. Savings evaporated like mist. The scenes were small and terrible. A mother counting notes at a kitchen table, a shopkeeper refusing a pile of paper because it could not cover a loaf, a child watching a father fold money as if it were kindling. The crisis was not only economic, it was a collapse of trust in the ordinary instruments that let a society function. In the midst of that chaos, a new government, led by Gustav Stresemann, made a hard choice. The policy of passive resistance was ended, and with that decision the immediate pressure on the economy eased. But the cost had been paid in a different currency. The national mood had been shattered, political rancor resurfaced, and the fragile unity that had briefly held during the crisis dissolved into renewed factionalism. Emergency powers were invoked. Bavaria, in particular, devolved authority to a local triumvirate that would later become the stage for dramatic confrontations. The hyperinflation episode left scars that would not fade with a single budget or decree. International financiers then stepped into the breach with plans meant to stabilize and to buy time. In mid-1924, an international committee, headed by an American banker named Charles G. Dawes, proposed a program that did not fix a final reparations total but did reduce the immediate annual burden and recommended substantial loans from foreign banks. Those loans, chiefly from the United States, flowed into Germany and helped to steady the currency and revive industry. The Dawes arrangement was, in effect, a breathing space. It eased payments for a time and invited foreign capital to rebuild factories and railways, and in doing so it created a fragile prosperity that depended on continued external credit. The presence of foreign loans had a double edge. They brought investment and a sense of normalcy, and they also made Germany's recovery dependent on the willingness of distant bankers to keep lending. For a few years the economy brightened, factories hummed again, and the currency regained a measure of credibility. Political life, too, found a new anchor in the person of Field Marshal von Hindenburg, whose election as president in 1925 reassured many Germans who still longed for continuity with the imperial past. His presence lent the Republic a veneer of tradition that made it easier for some to accept the new order. Yet the question of reparations was not settled. In July 1929, another international plan, the Young Plan, named for Owen D. Young, sought to set a final figure and a timetable. Unlike Dawes, the Young Plan fixed a total sum and specified an end date for payments. The number proposed was far lower than the original post-war assessment, and the end date lay decades ahead. For many Germans, the date itself became a symbol. The idea that a burden would not finally lift until near the end of the century felt like a moral sentence, and nationalist critics seized on the plan as proof that the nation remained under an unjust yoke. The Young Plan thus became a political lightning rod, and opponents used it to rally resentment and to argue that the Republic had failed to secure a just peace. Then the wider world convulsed. The American stock market's collapse in 1929 sent shock waves through the global financial system, and the loans that had propped up Germany's fragile recovery began to dry up. Banks called in credits, investment halted, factories slowed, and unemployment rose sharply. The fragile prosperity that had been built on foreign capital proved brittle when that capital withdrew. Small businesses failed, farmers watched prices for their crops collapse, and millions found themselves without work. The social consequences were immediate and deep. Desperation fed political polarization, and the center could no longer hold as extremes on both left and right gained traction. In this climate, the political fortunes of radical movements improved. Parties that promised decisive action, national revival, or protection from perceived enemies found a receptive audience among those who had lost jobs, homes, or hope. Electoral gains followed the economic downturn. A party that had been a marginal force a few years earlier now won a substantial block of seats in the Reichstag, signaling that the old political arrangements were under severe strain. The Depression did not create these movements out of nothing, but it amplified grievances and made previously marginal voices seem like plausible answers to a crisis that felt existential. A single night's blaze can change the shape of a nation. Flames licked the Reichstag's stone and glass, and the image of a parliament in smoke became a signal that something larger had shifted. A young Dutchman, Marinus van der Lubbe, was found at the scene and later executed for arson, but the meaning of the fire was contested from the first hour. Some saw a lone arsonist, others suspected a deliberate provocation. Whatever the truth, the event was seized and turned into a pretext for sweeping measures that would hollow out civil liberties. The government moved with a speed that felt rehearsed. An emergency decree, signed by the president at Hitler's urging, suspended key civil rights. Freedom of speech, assembly, and the press were curtailed, and the state acquired broad powers to detain and silence political opponents. In the weeks that followed, police and party auxiliaries rounded up thousands of communists, more than 4,000 by some counts, and many were held without trial. The decree did not merely punish a suspected crime. It rewired the legal framework so that dissent could be treated as a security threat rather than a political difference. Elections were held in this altered atmosphere. The party increased its representation in the Reichstag, though it still fell short of an absolute majority. The tally rose to 288 seats, a dramatic gain but not the total control its leaders desired. Rather than accept the limits of parliamentary arithmetic, the regime pressed for a legal instrument that would transfer legislative power to the executive. The opening ceremony at Potsdam, staged with imperial pageantry, the old crown prince present, and Field Marshal Hindenburg in full marshal's uniform, was a carefully choreographed moment meant to fuse the new government with Germany's storied past. It was theater designed to reassure and to legitimize. 2 days after that ceremony, the Reichstag debated an act that would hand Chancellor Hitler the power to govern by decree for 4 years. The Enabling Act was presented as an emergency remedy, a legal bridge to stability, and it passed by a large margin. 94 Social Democrats voted against it. Many of those dissenters would later be targeted, and 24 of them were murdered in the months that followed. Within a season, the Social Democrats were outlawed, other parties were banned, and the Reichstag became a chamber of echoes rather than a forum of contest. The legal forms of the Republic remained, but their substance had been hollowed out. The consolidation of power did not end with laws. It required the neutralization of rivals and the reordering of coercive forces. Ernst Röhm, once a comrade in arms and the leader of the SA, known as the Brown Shirts, harbored ambitions that alarmed both the military and the industrial backers of the regime. He envisioned a people's army that might absorb the regular forces, and his blunt talk and the SA's unruly behavior made him a liability. The Reichswehr, jealous of its prerogatives, and conservative elites, fearful of social disorder, pressed for a solution that would preserve the army's monopoly on organized force. The instrument chosen for that solution was the SS, a smaller, more disciplined body whose members swore personal loyalty to the leader. Heinrich Himmler, a man of quiet, bureaucratic intensity, had been entrusted with its supervision, and the SS was used to carry out a purge that would become known as the Night of the Long Knives. At dawn on June 30, 1934, Röhm and many of his associates were arrested. Some were executed on the spot, others were detained and later killed. The purge extended beyond the SA's leadership. Political rivals, former chancellors, and critics, among them General Kurt von Schleicher and Gustav von Kahr, were eliminated in a wave of violence that was justified as a defense of the nation and the army. The effect of the purge was to terrify potential opponents and to reassure the military and conservative elites that the new regime would not tolerate a rival armed force. It also demonstrated the SS's capacity for decisive action and the leaders' willingness to use extrajudicial means to settle political problems. Officially, the state announced that scores had been executed for plotting treason. Later evidence suggested the toll was higher and that many killings were summary and personal. 5 weeks after the purge, the old president died. Paul von Hindenburg's passing removed the last significant institutional check on Hitler's ambitions. He moved quickly to combine the offices of Chancellor and President, and he assumed the title that placed him above ordinary politics. A plebiscite followed, and millions voted to ratify the new arrangement. The numbers, over 38 million in favor, were presented as a popular seal on what had been accomplished by force, law, and spectacle. Germany was now firmly in the hands of Adolf Hitler.